Hey everyone and welcome to Java tutorial for beginners, the only resource you need to learn Java from scratch with no programming experience required. This tutorial has 5 parts that you can find in the Java programming playlist, and in this first video we're going to learn what is a programming language, what we need to install on our system to develop Java programs, and we're going to develop our first Java application in IntelliJ IDEA. So without further ado, hit the like button and let's jump into the first lecture of this tutorial. Hey everyone and welcome to the first lecture of this Java for Beginners course, where we're going to learn the very basics of the Java programming language. And I'm going to assume that you don't have any programming experience, so we're going to start with the very basic concepts first. So in this lecture, we're going to answer to the question, what is Java? And we probably know that Java is a programming language, but what is a programming language in the first place? And why do we actually need to learn programming languages? Well, to understand this, let's get a step back and really reason a little bit about the usefulness of a computer. So we know that computers are really good at storing information really accurate, but also on processing that information really fast. And the main component inside a computer which is responsible for this efficiency is called the CPU, or the Central Processing Unit, which is basically the core of any computer. Now, this component only deals with information stored in this format of ones and zeros, right? So it doesn't know to work with real world sentences, for example. They somehow need to get down to this data format that the CPU can understand. Now, on the other hand, human beings only work with real world sentences, right? With some strings, words, and so on, right? Now, of course, to be able to communicate between humans and computers, there has to be some way of expressing those instructions in some terms that computers can understand, right? So this is a place where programming languages come into the picture, because what they actually are is a combination of symbols and characters that can be transformed into instructions into this format of ones and zeros, right? So we can see that programming languages are just a communication interface between humans and computers, right? Now, Java is one programming language which is available out there in the industry. There are, of course, other ones, for example, C# or Golang or Kotlin or C++ or JavaScript and many other ones. Usually, every programming language has some strong points and some main reasons for which it has been created, but also some points where it doesn't really excel. Now, Java has been around for a while. It has been launched in 1995, and the main reason we should learn Java is because it's a very popular programming language. It has been embraced by a lot of very large companies to build backend systems. So that's the main niche in the software engineering industry where Java actually excels, in the backend or even big data workspace, where most of the components and the tools have been developed in the Java programming language. Now let's see what we actually need to install on our computer in order to be able to develop Java applications. There are two main things that we need to install. The first one is called the JDK, which stands for Java Development Kit. This is basically a kit of components that allow us to develop Java applications. It contains a number of things, for example, a debugger or some profiling tools, and the most important component is the Java runtime environment. This is basically a collection of classes and libraries that allow our programs to execute in some well-defined context. Now, the main reason the JDK contains the Java runtime environment is that without the Java runtime environment, you won't be able to execute Java applications. So, for example, if you are developing your Java application on your local machine, you need to run it to really see that it's working as expected, right? So, for that reason, you need the Java runtime environment. On the other hand, if you're developing your Java application on your local machine and you want to run it on a server in the cloud, for example, on that server, you only need to install the Java runtime environment, because out there you just want to run it. You don't develop the application on that server, right? Now, for each Java application which is executed, a Java virtual machine is being created. And a JVM is basically just like a sandbox for your Java application that ensures the fact that your application works as expected. So, for example, for Java applications, we are able to configure the maximum amount of memory that it can use. And if for some reason your application wants to consume more memory than the one which is configured, then the JVM will stop forcefully your application to make sure that it doesn't affect other processes in your system, right? You can see the JVM just like a sandbox, which is ensuring the fact that your application works as expected. Now, the second thing that we need to install on our machine is an IDE, or an integrated development environment. This is just an application with an editor where we can write the Java code and a bunch of tools around it that allow us to debug or build the code to make sure that it works as expected, but also some other nice features, for example, syntax highlighting or code completion, and other really amazing features that allow us to build the Java applications in a developer-friendly way. There are a couple of IDEs out there for Java. For example, Eclipse is a very popular one, but for this course, we're going to use IntelliJ IDEA because it's very easy to use, very modern, and widely adopted by a large number of developers. So now let's actually see on which websites we need to go to install those two components. So to be able to install a JDK, we just have to type on Google JDK download, and we just need to go on the first link, which is the one that belongs to Oracle, which is the company that maintains Java. And on this website, as you can see, we see the Java 17 version, which has just been released in September this year. And this is not a page that we're looking for because we want to download maybe an older version of Java, not necessarily the latest one. So to be able to do this, we just have to go here on the Java archive link, where we can see that we have a number of versions which are also older ones, right? So let's first understand what do we see on this page, right? Because pretty much all the things can be very new to you, right? So here, as you can see, we have Java SE. SE stands for Standard Edition. This is the flavor of Java that we're going to use for this course, because the other flavors are targeted for other use cases. For example, EE stands for Enterprise Edition, which is a version of Java that is more suited to enterprise applications, right? It has a couple of other features on top of it that we don't really need for this course. Java ME stands for Mobile Edition, which is obviously adapted to mobile systems. And also FX stands for a version of Java that allows us to develop desktop applications with a graphical user interface. And we're not going to dive into this for this course. So we're going to stick with the Java Standard Edition. Now, if you take a look on this right-hand side of the screen, we can see that we have a number of versions, right? And one question that you may have would be, what version is the one that I should pick? Well, to be able to get more insight around those versions, let's go on Wikipedia and type Java versions. And on this Wikipedia link, we can see a really nice table, which is very useful to understand more about each version of Java. So, as you can see here, Java appeared in 1995, as I just previously mentioned in the previous lecture. And on some of the versions here, we see this label that is called LTS. And this label stands for long-term support, which means that this particular Java version will be maintained by the Oracle team for a longer amount of time, right, compared to the other versions which don't have this LTS label. So as you can see here in this table, the Java 8 will be maintained up to December 2030, which is really useful, right? Because, for example, if you're a company, you may want to stick with the Java version that will be maintained for a longer amount of time. So as you can see, we also have Java 11 and Java 17 with this tag. So you can use pretty much any version of those three ones for this course. I'm going to stick with Java 11 because that's the one that I have installed on my system right now. But you can use any version of those three ones. If you have any strong reasons, you can use also the other versions that are not long-term support, because in this course, we're going to learn the very basics of the Java language. We're not going to dive into some features which are changed or adapted in different versions of Java, right? So just for you to know, usually stick with Java long-term support versions. Now, if you go back to the previous tab, and let's say we want to download the Java JDK, the JDK 11, we just have to click here on Java SE 11, and we're going to be directed to the page that contains the JDK. And we can see here that we have the Java Development Kit 11. This is the last version of JDK 11. There are also other versions, as you can see here, 11.0.10, 11.0.9, and so on. It's usually better to stick with the latest version of the JDK. And as you can see here, based on the operating system that you have, you need to download a specific binary file here on the right hand side. So you just have to select one of them and click on this. To be able to download this, you need to basically create an Oracle account, because as it mentions here, all the downloads of this page requires an Oracle account. So you just have to create one, register, and then the download will start. The installation process is very simple. It's just a very basic binary file. It doesn't have anything specific. Just make sure to keep in mind the path where this JDK is located, because we're going to need it when we install IntelliJ IDEA. And to actually do this, we need to go back on Google and type IntelliJ IDEA, and we're going to click on the first link. The internet connection is pretty slow nowadays, so we're going to click on the first link, which is the one that belongs to the JetBrains, which is the company behind IntelliJ IDEA, and we just have to click on this download page. So as you can see here, we have two versions of IntelliJ IDEA, the Ultimate and the Community version. We're going to stick with the Community version for this course because it has pretty much anything we need to develop a very basic Java application for this course. We just have to select the operating system that you have and hit the download button. If you want to know the differences between those versions, you have them broken down here. The advantages that the Ultimate Edition has are pretty advanced ones, right? As you can see here, it has an HTTP client, database support, Kubernetes support, and so on. We don't really need those advantages for this course, right? So it's really fine to stick with the Community Edition. Again, the installation process is very simple. You just have to click next, 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 and finish, and that's it. So now let's jump into the IntelliJ IDEA to create our first Java application. Alright, so now that you install IntelliJ IDEA, the next thing that we're going to do is to just open it, and we're going to see a window similar to this one. It slightly varies depending on the operating system, but the main idea is pretty much the same. You have this very simple welcome page with a couple of options here. We're going to choose the new project button here. We're going to click it, and we're going to see this new project window where we can select here on the left hand side a couple of options. We're going to stick, of course, with the Java option because the other ones usually need some kind of additions to them. So we're going to select the Java option here, and here on the project SDK, ideally you should be able to see this Java version already selected. If you're not seeing this here, it means that the IntelliJ IDEA didn't manage to detect automatically the JDK which is already installed on your machine. So you just have to click on this dropdown and click on Add JDK. And this will open a window where you basically need to select the directory where your JDK is installed. And you just have to click on this particular directory, click on Open, and you're going to see that JDK here on this dropdown. And you just have to select it, and that's it. Now we're going to let those options unchecked for the moment. We're going to hit Next. And here we're going to click on Create Project from Template. And we have this only template called Command Line Application. This means that we want to build a Java application that can only be executed from the command line. So it doesn't have any fancy graphical user interface for the moment, because this actually requires some more knowledge, and we're going to maybe take a shot on this to see how it actually works, right, with JavaFX, for example. But for this course, we're going to stick with the command line application. We're going to hit Next, and here we have a couple of options that we need to set. The first one is the project name. And we're going to see here Java course. This is of course the location on the local list that you can change if you want the project to be located in a different directory. And this is the base package name. So we're going to see further in this course what packages are. You can place here pretty much any string you want for the moment. I'm just going to update it to com.java.course. So we're going to hit finish, and that's it. We're going to wait for a moment. So as you can see here in the bottom of the screen, we have this progress bar, which says that things are currently in progress, just finished. So this is the place where we're going to spend pretty much all the time on this course, because that's the way you should learn Java, right? By just writing it, debugging it, and building applications using this language, right? There's no other way you can learn or become proficient in any programming language actually. So I'm going to zoom this a little bit out, and you can see here that in this part of the screen we have the editor, which is built into the actual IntelliJ idea. And this is the place where we're going to write the Java code. In the left side, we can see that we have this project window, which has this expandable directory that is called Java course, which is the name of our project actually. And if we expand this, we can see that we have two directories. The one is .idea. This contains some metadata around configuration that we have for the IntelliJ idea in this particular project. It has a couple of files, but we're not interested in them for this course, so we can just ignore this directory altogether. The interesting one is this one, which has source. As you can see here, we got the package name that we just completed previously. And here we have the main.java file, which has our Java code. Apart from that, we have some external libraries here. And as you can see here, this points to the content of the JDK. So those libraries are actually part of the Java runtime environment or part of the Java development kit. So they are basically mixed here. So we're going to get into more details on the anatomy of this very simple Java program in the next lecture. But for the moment, let's see how can we run some hello world instruction here and also print it on the screen. So in this particular method, right, in this particular area of the code, we're going to say system.out.println or println. So what this means is that we want to print something on the screen. And inside those parentheses, we need to say what do we actually want to print on the screen. And we're going to open double quotes, and we're going to say hello world, or any string or any text that you want, right? And this instruction says, I just want to print this string on the screen. Now to be able to see this in action, we have to run the program. And to be able to do this, we just have to click on this green arrow here. It will expand to this very small contextual menu, and we can just select the first option, which simply runs the application. As you can see, the progress bar started to do something here in the bottom of the screen. Just have to wait a little bit. So as you can see, we have here this particular area of the IDE, which is basically called the console. Here we can see our text, right? And also we can see that the process finished with exit code 0. And this means that our application finished successfully, so there was no error during the execution, right? This particular area of the screen is called the console, and it really helps us to see the output of our application, to really see if the application works as we expect, or any message that the application will generate can be seen here. So this is your first Java application. In the next lecture, we're going to get into more details on the specific syntax of the language, and we're going to really start learning this language properly. Alright, so now that we created our first Java application, let's actually understand what each line of code in this program actually does. So in the line number 1 here, we have this keyword called package, followed by a space, and then followed by the package name that we just completed when we created the project, right? So in Java, a package is basically a way of storing multiple files together. It's kind of a namespace or sandbox. You can see it like a sandbox or simply a directory, right? It's just a way of grouping multiple files or actually multiple classes together, as we'll see in the further lectures. And it's nothing more than that, right? And in this particular file, we are telling to the program that we're currently in this particular package. You can create packages by just going right here on the left-hand side of the screen, and we can just right-click on this package or even on this directory. Let's click on this existing package to exemplify how this actually works. And we can just go on new and then select package. And here we can basically add any name that we want for this new package that we want to create, right? For example, test. As you can see here, we have this new package created inside this base package. Now, this is actually a directory on the local disk, right? So if you just go on reveal in Finder, that's how the Explorer is basically named on the Mac. And as you can see, we have here each keyword. So com, Java, and course, those words separately are basically a different directory on the local disk. And also test, the package that we just created, is one of them, right? So inside this package, we can create any other class that we want. For example, test2, right? If we create this class inside this package, we can see that the first instruction basically changes accordingly, which simply tells us in which package that particular class belongs, right? So now going back to the test class, it was initially named main, but I renamed it to test. So the next line, as you can see, is just an empty line. In any Java program, we can have as many empty lines as we want. So the program does not enforces us to have some certain number of new lines in our application. But as a best practice, you should not have so many new lines in your code because it would make the code harder to read and understand. Now, moving on to the line 3, we can see here that we have a definition of a class. And for the moment, you can see a class just like a place in your code where you can add some functionality or some instructions, right? It's basically the same thing. We're going to have multiple lectures where we're going to explore this concept of a class because it has a little bit more nuances that we need to understand. But for the moment, you can just see it just like a place where you add functionality in your code. Now, in this definition here, you can see that it has this public keyword, which means that this class is accessible or can be referenced in other files in your code. Because usually in Java projects, we have multiple classes and they usually need to talk to each other. So by using those access modifiers, in this case public, we can restrict or allow access to some classes in our code. To make you an idea, instead of public, we also have private. And private actually means that this class test is not accessible by other classes in our project. And we also have protected. And we're going to talk about this one in a further lecture as well. The keyword class, of course, defines the fact that we were trying to define a class here. And then we have the class name. This name can be basically any string that we want. The only restriction is that this name has to be the same to the one of the file where this class belongs. So for example, if we are trying to call this class test2, by the way, you can also add numbers in class definitions. You can see that we have this error, and IntelliJ IDEA is telling us that class test2 is public and should be declared in a file name test2.java. So we're going to update the name of the file to resolve this error. So instead of test, we're going to say test2, and I'm going to click on refactor, which means just update or change, in this case, the name of the file. So as you can see now, the error is basically resolved. Now, after the class name, we can see that we have this curly bracket. And if we place the cursor right behind it, we can see that IntelliJ IDEA highlights another curly bracket, which is right here on line 8, which is basically the last character in our application. So what this means is that those curly brackets are basically in a pair. And what they actually do is to define a scope for that particular class. And a scope is basically just an area of the code that belongs to a specific object, or in this case, it belongs to the class test2. So in other words, any code that we're writing inside those two curly brackets will belong to this class. If we write other code here, for example, if we take this instruction and place it here, it doesn't belong to any class, right? We have to define a class around it and also a method in this particular case to make it valid or compliant to the Java syntax. Now moving on to this particular line, to the line number 5, what we have here is the definition of a method, or in other languages, you can see this as a definition of a function, because usually methods and function can be used interchangeably in some context. In this case, we're going to refer to them as methods. So a method usually is basically just a block of code that performs a certain action. It's very similar to a function in math, right? So for example, let's take the f of x equals to x plus 1, right? So for example, if instead of x you say f of 3, then the result will be 3 plus 1, which is equal to 4, okay? So a method is very similar to this particular construction. And I'm pretty sure that the origin of this way of construction in programming languages has been inspired from this concept that is found in mathematics. So this x here is basically the argument. In programming world, we call this a parameter. And if we take a look on this function, you can notice that inside those parentheses, we have a parameter, which is in this case is an array of strings. And this operation here, which is the main functionality of that particular function, is basically part of this block of code, which is also delimited by those curly brackets as well. So inside those curly brackets, we can basically add any instruction that we want. Actually, let's also create a method which illustrates this particular function to kind of see how it actually works. So let's create another function called public. It will return an integer, which is basically just a number, right? And let's call it f. And here inside the parentheses, we need to specify the type of parameter that this function will have. In this case, int and x, right? X is the name of the parameter. And the only thing that this function or method needs to execute is to return the value of x plus 1, which means that it will take the argument, it will add it by 1, and it will return the result back to the caller or to the code that called this function. So this particular construction here is basically equivalent to this function that we can see here, okay? And if you want to get a result for f of 3, you can just have to say here f of 3. And the only thing that we missed here is the static keyword. So what this will print us if we run the code now, it will say hello world followed by the value of that. So we're going to we just have to build the application first. And now we just have to run it. Yeah. So as you can see, we got the hello world and the number 4, which is f of 3, right? If we make a parallel of this method with this one, there are a couple of differences. First of all, this method returns an integer. This method returns void. Void means nothing. So basically this means that the Java does not expect this method to have some return instruction inside this code. So for example, if instead of int, we're saying here void, we're going to have an error saying that we cannot return a value from a method with void result type, which is exactly what I mentioned previously, right? So if you have a method that returns nothing, you shouldn't have any return statement inside it. And by the way, you probably realize that return followed by something means that the value that we just computed will be transferred back to the code that launched the call to that function. In this case, this code, okay? The other difference between those functions is the name. In this case, the name of the method, which is main in this case, is really important because any Java application should have a single method called main with this particular structure, this signature basically, because this method is the entry point of our Java application. So we can have as many classes, as many methods, or any complex structure of our application, we should have one main method, right? That's very important. And this particular parameter here, you may wonder who's going to provide the value for this particular parameter. As you can see in this case, we just put here the value 3 to make the call to this function, right, to see what's the result. But in this case, the arguments are not placed by us. They are placed by the framework or the runtime, in this case, Java runtime environment, when we're going to launch this application from command line. And we're going to see in a further lecture how can we do this. Those are basically just command line arguments, right? So if you go to the terminal and you want to run this application from the terminal instead of running it from IntelliJ IDEA, you're able to pass some arguments here. We can also do this from IntelliJ IDEA if you go here on Edit Configurations, and here on Program Arguments we add some values, for example, value 1 followed by value 2, for example. If we hit apply and hit OK, and we just place and we just print them here, and this actually need to be wrapped inside of an arrays to string, because Java doesn't know to print an array of strings directly. And we just comment this out a little bit and we run the program. We can see that the values that we just added there in the configuration are printed here, okay? So that's the meaning of this particular parameter. It's not something too complex, it's just command line arguments. We're not going to dive into them so extensively in this course because they're not so relevant or important, but it's really good to have all the aspects clarified. Now, the last thing that I wanted to talk about in this lecture is the static keyword. This is basically a way of specifying the fact that this method is not linked to an object of this class. And of course, we're going to have multiple lectures which are diving into the concept of objects and classes as well. You can see this static keyword just like an instruction which tells that method that is not linked or related to any other entity. It's kind of an individual entity in your code that can be called independently. So the reason we had to add this static keyword here is because we're calling this method from a static method that's already declared here. So all the methods which are derived from it needs to be in the same way as independent as the method that they are called from, right? So basically that's the simplest Java application that we can write. The one that just prints hello world or pretty much any other very simple string. Now let's move on to the next lecture.